John Peter Zenger was an author of the New York Weekly Journal. In 1773 he used the journal to publish critical comments about colonial governor William Cosby. He was arrested and went on trial in 1734 on seditious libel charges. The jury found him not guilty because they supported his actions against the governor. This case laid the foundation for freedom of press in the colonies and eventually in America. The Bill of Rights was proposed by Founding Father James Madison to Congress. It initially included 12 amendments, but ratification only permitted 10 to take effect. The intention of the Bill of Rights was to ensure individual citizens' personal liberties and rights, as the Constitution continued to place a great deal of power in the federal government. Many anti-federalists such as Thomas Jefferson were concerned with preserving state and personal rights. The rights stated in the Bill of Rights are still consistently quoted in debates today, such as the rights to assemble, freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment right to bear arms. The 10 amendments stated in the Bill of Rights go as follows. The First Amendment preserves freedom of religion, speech, petition, assembly, and press. The Second Amendment preserves the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment states that the government may not force citizens to quarter troops. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment awards every citizen the right to due process before the law, the right not to convict oneself, and the right to retain private property. The Sixth Amendment gives the right to a speedy trial by jury. The Seventh Amendment is like the Sixth Amendment but shorter. The Eighth Amendment protects against excessive bail and distractingly terrible audio quality. Cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment protects the rights that are specifically outlined in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment states that any laws not specifically outlined in the Constitution are reserved to the jurisdiction of each individual state or to the people. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were 4 bills passed by Federalists after the French Revolution and during the Quasi-War with France. The acts include an extended requirement of residency for immigrants before becoming legal citizens. Also, there were limits on the ability of people to speak poorly of the president or other government officials during wartime. The Democratic Republicans strongly opposed these acts and restrictions on civil liberties, which led Thomas Jefferson to pass the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions as soon as he entered the presidency after the election of 1800. These early civil liberties legislations would set the precedent for government restrictions on civil liberties during wartime in America's future. The 14th Amendment was passed during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment stated that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deny any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. During the Civil War, President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in order to silence journalists and copperheads during his campaign to preserve the Union. Lincoln claimed that these opposers were detrimental to the efforts of the Union, and therefore imprisoned a great deal of critics until the end of the Civil War. After the inception of the United States, many states required able-bodied men to go through basic military training and enroll in the militia. During the Civil War, about 2% of the Union's troops were drafted, and about 6% were substitutes paid by draftees. The Confederacy also used the draft, but allowed slave owners of 20 or more slaves to be exempt from service. The largest opposition to this draft came in 1863, when New York City inhabitants, especially Irish Americans, filled the streets to protest against the draft. Lincoln was forced to send militia units to dismember these riots. During World War I, the Selective Service Act of 1917 was passed, in order to require able-bodied men aged 18 to 45 years old to help out in the national war effort, with almost no opportunity for exemption. World War II implemented similar strategies of drafting men aged 21 to 45 by way of national lottery. However, during World War II, many more Americans supported the draft because they believed that German and Italian victory would be horrible for American society. During the Cold War, the Selective Service Act of 1948 was passed, marking one of the first times that a draft was utilized during peacetime. Selective service recruited about 1.5 million men for the Korean War. During the Cold War, many American men signed up voluntarily for military service in order to choose where they could be stationed. The Vietnam War drafted about 2.2 million men for service. It is estimated that most of the 8.7 million volunteers joined the Vietnam War effort in order to avoid the draft. Today, men are required to register for the draft once they turn 18, in the case that a draft should be instated due to a national crisis. The U.S. has utilized the military draft on multiple occasions. There has been a continued debate over the years as to whether or not the use of the draft infringes people's personal rights. The Sedition and Espionage Acts of 1917 were designed to prevent domestic opposition to the U.S. involvement in World War I. They prevented citizens from interfering with military operations, supporting the enemy, or interfering with military recruitment. Overall, they restricted a great deal of civil liberties in the United States in order to create domestic stability while U.S. soldiers were overseas. The Schenck case in 1919 was a Supreme Court decision that supported the Espionage Act of 1917. This case stated that citizens did not have the First Amendment right to criticize the draft during World War I. The Supreme Court said that criticism would provide clear and present danger to the United States war effort. This phrase's more colloquial example is that it is not socially acceptable to yell "fire" in a crowded theater. During World War II, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in 1942. This executive order allowed the federal government to intern Japanese Americans in camps. Despite being American citizens, nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, 11,000 German Americans, and 3,000 Italian Americans were sent to internment camps. They were uprooted from their homes and forced to recreate communities in these internment camps for the duration of World War II. This shows the federal government's willingness to completely disregard civil liberties in order to ensure domestic tranquility. In an attempt to make amends with the Japanese Americans, Ronald Reagan passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which paid reparations to those who were interned in camps. These actions showed the federal government's recognition that the internment was a blatant violation of the rights of the Japanese Americans. In the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade, it was decided that a woman had the right to get an abortion. This case sparked national debate that continues today. Pro-choice advocates argue that it is a woman's right to control her own bodily integrity, and thus the decision should be solely hers on whether or not to continue with her pregnancy. This issue shows the continuous moral confliction over the interpretation of the rights expressed in the Constitution. Proposition 8 was a proposed California state amendment that passed in November 2008. This proposition stated that marriage in California would only be legally recognized if it was between a man and a woman. This perpetuated a debate that still awaits constitutional ruling about the legality of restricting marriage rights of same-sex couples under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Here again is a debate sparked by the differing interpretations of constitutional rights.